Good morning, everyone. I'm Jonathan Tepperman. I'm the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy. Welcome to this FP Insider conference call. Since the coronavirus pandemic began, these calls have become an evolving exploration of how the disease and our responses to it are changing our world. In previous meetings, we've talked about COVID's impact on great power politics, on fiscal policy, on cities, supply chains, energy markets, and more. Today, I want us to focus on a topic that's been the subject of a lot of nervous speculation, but very little detailed discussion so far, especially from our leaders who have been virtually silent on the subject. And that topic is US national security. The question, put most simply, is whether the pandemic has made the United States and its citizens less safe, and if so, how, and what can we do about it? Now, before we get into that, I think we need to take some time to reflect on the protests and the violence that have been convulsing our country over the last week. I live in Brooklyn, that's where I'm making this call from, and the scene here has been both inspiring and deeply upsetting. All of a sudden, it's like our city and our country is going through the crises of 1968 and 1917 at the same time. And it's not that difficult to connect the new crisis with the one we were already caught in before the murder of George Floyd on May 25th. Before I get into all of that with our guests, please bear with me as I make a few quick technical announcements. In order to make this conversation as interactive as possible, as much of a true conversation as we can, we're going to be taking questions from the audience in the second half. Here's how you ask one. For those of you who have logged in via Zoom, just click the Q&A button at the bottom of your window. Another screen will pop up and you can type your question there. For those of you who are joining us by phone, please email your questions to web@foreignpolicy.com. In both cases, please be sure to tell us your first name, your organization, and your location, where you're joining us from. Okay, here we go. I'm very proud to introduce our speakers for today's call. I've known both Kori Schake and Jake Sullivan for years, and I can tell you that they're two of the smartest, most creative, and most influential foreign policy thinkers working today. Kori is the new Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. She's a veteran Republican policy advisor, having served at the US State Department, the Department of Defense, and the National Security Council. Jake, meanwhile, is currently a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and an informal senior campaign advisor to Vice President Joe Biden. He's also a former director of policy planning at State, among other things. We are very lucky to have them both with us. Kori and Jake, please turn on your mics and your cameras now. Hi, welcome to you both. So we're supposed to be talking about national security today. So let me ask you to connect that with what's happening in the streets right now. Are the protests, or I think more to the point, the underlying injustices and inequalities that inspired them, are they actually affecting US national security, or do they have the potential to do that? And are they something that foreign policy wonks like us and many of the people on this call should be worried about for foreign policy reasons? Kori, you were quoted in the Times this morning saying, if we were seeing this in another country, we would be deeply concerned and talking about the foreign policy consequences of those states behaving this way. So what are the consequences for this state?
So I think there are three kinds of consequences. The first is whether we can sustain American power, by which I mean to say America's fundamental democratic institutions under the pressure that the Trump administration has put them under for the last 3.5 years. The second way it will affect American foreign policy is it will, of course, affect our standing in the world, that we look no different and no better than the kinds of countries that we have sanctioned, that we have tried to draw into more stable, more liberal patterns of governance. So American soft power takes a big hit here. And our ability to criticize China's crackdown in Hong Kong, for example, or the disgraceful behavior of the Sisi government in Egypt towards journalists in their own country, those things get a lot harder. And the third way is that my sense is that these challenges are going to expand our definition of national security. Both the COVID-19 pandemic is going to expand national security to include health, for example, and the ability to track the spread of disease internationally. And the injustice and the crackdown on peaceful protests are also going to make our domestic compact a much more central part of how we think about national security.
Thanks, Kori. Jake, I'm curious what you think, and in particular, how worried you are about foreign powers exploiting this new crisis. I mean, yes, it does give them a great rhetorical advantage, whether it's Javad Zarif tweeting about Black Lives Matters, or as Kori was saying, the Chinese saying, really, you want to criticize us about Hong Kong right now? But do you see that affecting US material interests, or US interests in a really material way beyond the rhetorical?
Well, first, I completely agree with Kori on the three elements that she laid down. And you know, I would say at the outset, very fundamentally, that the United States cannot be a secure country if we are not capable of being a just and equal country. And that fundamental definition, elemental definition of security, transcends the kind of larger foreign policy considerations that we spend our days thinking about. That's really about who we are as a nation. It's about the sustainability of American democracy, the vitality of the promise that our Constitution makes. And I think for foreign policy professionals, we oftentimes kind of take what happens within the borders of the United States for granted and say, okay, we're just gonna look to see how we then apply that around the world. I think for those who spend their time thinking about foreign policy and national security, there is no more urgent priority right now than to focus in on these really basic questions about what this says about who the United States is, what our institutions are made of, and what we are delivering for all of our citizens. And in that regard, I would say the priority of kind of holding the mirror up to ourselves is higher than the priority of thinking about how foreign powers might either try to exploit it, take advantage of it, or use it from a kind of rhetorical perspective as your question raises. But that doesn't mean that that's not an important question as well. It is. And I think there are two factors that concern me going forward. One is that I do think the Russian playbook has proven out both in the United States and in democracies across Europe, is all about trying to take pre-existing divisions and inflame them and try to create an information warfare campaign that seeks to drive further wedges between various segments of American society. And I expect that we will see that in the months to come. Mm-hmm. It will not be the dominant story compared to what's actually just happening on America's streets and in America's communities. But it is something that I think from a national security perspective, our intelligence community and our national security professionals should be paying attention to.
And let me interrupt you just for a sec. Is it worse in the sense that it won't be the dominant story? I mean, does it risk being ignored because we have so many other seemingly more pressing priorities?
Well, I think you know, I don't want to sound too partisan here, and I should hasten to note I'm speaking today on my own behalf, not on behalf of anyone else or a campaign. I think it's going to be ignored because the current administration has indicated very clearly for 3 years that they do not consider this a priority, whether there were protests in the streets or not. And so I'm not sure what's happening today in the United States changes the basic equation, which is that you have a current administration that does not believe that it should be at the top of their agenda to protect the American democratic system and institutions and the electoral process from foreign interference. But I just want to make one more point that reinforces something Kori said, which is I do think it's more than just rhetorical. The aid and comfort that the kinds of steps that we see with the invocation of the Insurrection Act or the scene in Lafayette Park, or frankly, the way that the police treat African-American citizens in our country, I think this gives something more than just rhetorical support or a rhetorical tool for dictators and autocrats and thugs in other parts of the world. I think it leads them to believe, in a moment of great contestation around democracy today, that they are righteous, that no longer should they have to listen to any of these countries who are complaining to them about human rights or freedoms or equality. And I think that has a profoundly corrosive effect going forward.
Well, thank you. I think we should pivot to the pandemic now. So let me ask the following question. By the way, one of my goals, I should say, for this conversation is to try and get you, Jake, and you, Kori, to disagree about something. There was a time when the two of you were on different sides, as a Republican advisor and a Democratic advisor, but because you're both basically liberal internationalists and institutionalists, and we have a president who just wants to light all of that on fire, the teams have been scrambled. Anyway, Kori, if you'll forgive the cliche, I want to ask you, when you think about the pandemic, and national security, what keeps you awake these nights? And I mean, what beyond the existential dread that is causing insomnia in all of us? What are the most worrisome ways in which you think the country has become less safe in the last 3 or 4 months since the pandemic really broke open?
Well, I think we are seeing what people like Jake and me have long been criticizing about President Trump's America First foreign policy, which is that what international cooperation and international institutions focusing on identifying what's happening in the world, what those things give us is strategic depth. We don't have to start solving problems when they already arrive on our shores. It seems to me the most important example of a missed opportunity is that the US Centers for Disease Control had a position in the Chinese Health Administration, and the Trump administration unfunded it as part of their 30% cut to American diplomatic and international representation. And what that did was remove our ability to see early what was happening inside China's healthcare system, no matter what the Chinese government said. And it built alliances among healthcare professionals in the US and China that would have made us more safe. And it might not have produced the kind of concern at high levels in the Trump administration to take action early because of the enormous leadership failures of the Trump administration in not addressing the obvious approach of the pandemic. But it would have created the ability to do that better. And so I think for me, the biggest concern is the damage the Trump administration has done to patterns and institutions for international cooperation in ways that give the United States the ability to see problems early and act on problems early, along with other countries that are equally concerned.
Jake, let me ask you for your take, and I have I want to hear your thoughts on China in particular, because I know that's something that you've been working on a lot recently. There has been a lot of talk about China using this moment to take advantage of the United States, but there are also reasons to think that some of the threats we hear about the most may be overblown. For example, China's charm campaign, as it's attempted to pose to as a good friend to countries suffering from the pandemic, has backfired in a number of cases. China's island building, which it's resumed in the South China Sea, has in the past only served to push countries on its periphery closer to the United States. And meanwhile, its clampdown on Hong Kong could seriously undermine that city's enormous economic value to Beijing. So what's your assessment on China in particular? Has the crisis, the pandemic, allowed it to increase its strength, power, and threat relative to the United States?
Well, I do think China has managed to secure some tactical gains in this. First, the United States picking up its ball and going home from a major international organization like the WHO only serves China's purposes. That vacuum that the United States leaves gets filled by Beijing. Second, the fact that the United States is #1 in the world in cases, in deaths, in unemployment claims, while the Chinese response, even if the numbers are cooked to a certain extent, which I think we can expect that they were, did not produce those kinds of outcomes, does give China the capacity to say, look, our system actually knows how to deal with this, and the United States is a complete and utter mess. And I think that does have reverberating consequences. Third, I think China is positioning itself, and we've seen this just over the last week with how they're relating now to these debt discussions around the emerging economies. They're positioning themselves to take advantage of fiscal and debt crises around the world to continue to expand their economic influence and coercion. But strategically, does that mean at the end of the day that China emerges from this in a kind of discontinuously powerful position, that this was kind of the moment where China becomes the dominant actor? That is by no means a foregone conclusion. I mean, first of all, China still has to contend with enormous domestic economic and governance challenges, some of which, by the way, were laid bare by the pandemic. The fact that they had such a brittle system that they could not respond, they had to kind of squelch the initial indicators of this out of Wuhan, should be a warning sign, and some of the broader economic concerns that they're dealing with. And then secondly, an authoritarian regime that relies upon repression and an extreme set of policies to keep its own people in line is not going to necessarily be the greatest at soft power and attractive power to the rest of the world. And I think we've already seen their heavy-handed tactics backfire in Europe and other places, and I think that will continue as well. So the opportunity remains very much for the United States to emerge from this in a sound place, but that's going to take sound leadership. And the possibility remains that actually over time, what looks like Chinese gains in the short term don't actually translate into long-term Chinese advantage. But again, that's contingent upon a more effective policy than the policy that we've seen come out of this administration so far.
We already have questions streaming in from our listeners, so I'm going to ask one now, and it dovetails with something that I wanted to ask you about China. Nathan Gardells writes that with respect to national security in China, conflict with China is inexorable on the one hand, and yet cooperation is also imperative. As much as US national security may require containment, mustn't it also involve a partnership of rivals with China where interests converge? And that's something I want to ask you about vis-a-vis Vice President Biden. And I know you're speaking today in a private capacity, but Fareed Zakaria argued in his last column, or the one before that, that Biden risks falling into a trap on China laid by President Trump by trying to prove that he's tougher than the president, rather than arguing that China requires a more nuanced approach, a combination of both confrontation and cooperation, as Nathan was referring to as well. How does Biden avoid falling into that trap, and what is the best response?
So maybe the best way to answer that is actually by anecdote. I traveled with Vice President Biden when I was his national security advisor to China, to Beijing at the end of 2013, shortly after Beijing had declared an air defense identification zone over the East China Sea, including over the Senkaku Islands. And the vice president had several hours, I think it was somewhere between 7 and 9 hours of meetings with Xi Jinping over the course of the day, including a long dinner with just a few people on each side. In the course of that, he looked Xi Jinping in the eye and said, as respects your air defense identification zone, the United States is simply not going to respect it. We're going to fly B-52s through it. We're going to treat it as though it does not exist. And there's nothing you can do about that. That's just how it's going to be. But he also said, hey, why don't we start thinking about the way in which the United States and China could come to some agreement around climate commitments that could help serve as the foundation or the basis for an ultimate climate deal, an international climate deal. The vice president was perfectly capable of standing up to Chinese aggression with a strong, credible American response, and at the same time say, where it's in our interest to work with Beijing, we'll work with them. I think the most important piece of this from the vice president's perspective is that we should not see cooperation with China as somehow them doing us a favor. That somehow if they come along and say, okay, we'll work with you on climate or pandemics, that they've been nice to us and therefore we should go easy on them in some way. But rather to see it as two countries with mutual interests in key areas, stopping the spread of nuclear weapons or pandemics or carbon emissions, and having a hard-headed view that practically speaking, we will want to work with Beijing in these areas of mutual interest, even as we continue to compete more effectively and push back more emphatically in the areas where we have profound disagreement. And I think that's how the vice president has approached this relationship for years and would continue to approach it if he were elected president.
So Jonathan, may I offer an answer to that as well?
Yeah, please.
The first is the vice president could do no better than follow the outline that Hal Brands and Jake Sullivan published about
more agreement.
China's alternative paths. The second thing is that President Trump has not had particularly sound China policy. He's been unnecessarily provocative. He's alienated America's allies who are essential in creating a common front to drive China towards accepting the international standards and the international practices that are the ultimate aim of American policy. And third, President Trump and his advisors are acting as though the effort to engage China, to draw them into the rules-based international order was some wild liberal mistake, when in fact it strengthened America's hand to show that we believed that a powerful, prosperous China could and should be a regular part of the international order. China in the last several years under Xi Jinping, but also under Hu Jintao before him, has not taken up that cooperative path, and it should still be our policy to drive them towards it without over-militarizing our response, without alienating America's friends who share our concerns about a rising China.
So you still think that China can be turned into some kind of a responsible stakeholder?
I do. I don't think in the near term, but I still fundamentally believe that Hegel is right, and that as people become more prosperous, they become more demanding political consumers, and that in the medium to long term, that's where China will be driven, because I don't believe they can continue to be prosperous unless they become more politically representative.
Let's turn off China for a second and move on to another threat that's not getting much attention lately. The administration has been making it clear for years now that it's no longer interested in the fight against international terrorism. We've seen it in its pivot towards great power contestation, and now Trump is only muddying the waters further by talking about protesters in the United States as though they're the terrorists. But do you see, Kori, non-state actors taking advantage of the pandemic? You know, we haven't heard much from the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda recently, although IS has been active in Iraq with a lot of recent attacks there. But I'm curious what your assessment is of how the crisis has affected their standing and their potential and ability to cause harm.
It has, for me, been surprising that terrorist organizations like the Taliban, who have been extraordinarily destructive, the number of attacks on Afghan civilians and Afghan government facilities in the last several months, when the Taliban not honoring the agreement to move forward on a peace deal. I think that has been a huge move by a terrorist organization. What I think neither ISIS nor the Taliban nor the emergent jihadist groups in the Sahel have understood is the way that, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood created political legitimacy, created an opening to be an electoral force or a shaper of governments by providing services that the Egyptian government, for example, had failed to do. And I think in the time of pandemic, they're really missing a huge opening and opportunity to adopt peaceful social service practices that would legitimate them. So I grieve the destruction in particular that the Taliban are bringing in this time, but I also think they are not advancing their cause by creating political legitimacy in dealing with some of the consequences of the pandemic.
Thanks, Kori. I want to remind our audience that you could ask questions in two ways, either via the Zoom app, just click the Q&A button, or email them to web@foreignpolicy.com. And a reminder too, please, to tell us not just your name, but where you are and what institution you belong to. Let me ask now a question posed by Jenna Ben Yehuda. She asks if we can talk about the civil-military breakdown in the United States, with Milley walking around in fatigues on the streets of DC, Esper's comments on dominating the battle space, meaning the United States. What can, should be, and what can or should be done to right this balance? What's the role of Congress, et cetera? Jake, you want to start? Well, Kori, your mic is already open.
I'd like to defer to Kori because I have strong views on the subject, but she has more informed views in the sense that this is something that she has thought and written a lot about. So I think she should first crack at it.
So first, it's both disgraceful and dangerous that the senior military and civilian leadership of the Department of Defense are talking about American cities as battle space and American citizens in the way that they are. It's disturbing, it's dangerous, and it's shameful. And it causes concern that the professionalism of our military is coming under the same kind of pressure that professionalism of the FBI, professionalism of the Justice Department, the way that the Trump administration is corroding both the norms and the institutions of democracy in America is a cause for deep concern, I think. And the response to the protests, which after all, what these protesters are asking for is the fundamental American political compact of equal justice under law. That should be celebrated. That should be something we can all get behind as a matter of national unity. And it's disappointing that Secretary Esper and General Milley aren't meeting the standard of upholding their commitment to the Constitution.
And are you surprised that this sorry to interrupt you, and we'll get back to your second point in a second, but are you surprised that this eroding of norms and values has happened so quickly? I mean, no institution in the United States is more famous than the military for spending years and years inculcating these very values that are now being trampled into its men and women in uniform.
So I wouldn't take Secretary Esper and General Milley's comportment as the sole indicator of where the American military establishment is on this. I would point out that retired Admiral Mike Mullen, a predecessor as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, made a very eloquent and heartfelt plea I know that there are lots of other senior military leaders and lots of rank and file military folks who are very concerned about this as well. I would point you towards the exemplary behavior of the Commandant of the Marine Corps a couple of months ago, banning the Confederate flag and Confederate symbols before the protests even started, because of the desire of the military to have everybody on the team feeling like full contributors, and the exemplary behavior of the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Dave Goldfein, and the Sergeant Major of the Air Force, who, if you have not seen his op-ed piece and his Twitter feed on his experience as a Black man in America, they speak very profoundly to the challenges of the country at this time. So I personally believe that Secretary Esper and General Milley are more of an outlier of military attitudes and are getting an earful from veterans, from active duty service people about concerns about how they are representing the American military establishment in this difficult time.
Jonathan, I think you're on mute.
Excuse me, I was muted. Sorry about that. Byron Callan, Capital Alpha Partners in Connecticut, asks, Jake, if you have thoughts on how this is going to, this meaning the pandemic, I assume, is going to change US defense plans and budgets. There's this consensus that there's going to be all of this pressure on the pocketbook in the years ahead, both from dramatically reduced tax income and then this unprecedented fiscal outlay. Will that necessarily affect US defense spending? And I would add, perhaps even more critically, spending on non-defense areas of US foreign policy, like foreign aid, support for democracy, et cetera, which tends to, the size of which tends to be dramatically overestimated in the mind of American taxpayer, and which is always, it seems, first in line when politicians start cutting budgets.
Sure. I think the first and most important thing for us to learn from the 2008 financial crisis is that austerity is not the answer. That deciding today we can't spend to make the kinds of investments required to generate millions of new good-paying jobs, that generate growth, that generate long-term revenue, that is the ultimate path to fiscal sustainability in this country, not a lot of green eye shading around how we can slash 50 billion here or 100 billion there. So I hope that the kind of response, fiscal response that we have seen so far from the Congress, which has been unprecedented and quite remarkable in its magnitude and scope, even if some elements of it have been implemented quite poorly, that continues, that we continue to make real meaningful investments in the sources of America's strength, in infrastructure, in innovation, in education, in job creation here at home. And frankly, I don't think that means you're going to have to take some big red pen to the defense budget from the point of view of, fiscal responsibility. I think where we have to look with respect to the defense budget, and I've written a piece about this in Foreign Affairs, is to take Kori's basic insight from her first answer, which is let's have a broader definition of what counts as national security and try to have a holistic national security budget where we're allocating our dollars in a way that is more sized and scoped to the actual threats that we face. And for that, I would advocate for reduced spending on some traditional hardware platforms and increased spending on issues of innovation, of economic statecraft, and yes, of diplomacy and development. Kori's point about the slashing of our overseas presence for CDC and HHS, leading directly to us not having eyes and ears on the ground in China when the virus, when the epidemic broke out in Wuhan, is a profound reminder that those kinds of investments, the bang for their buck, is extraordinary. So I would advocate for us not thinking in terms of dramatic budget cuts, really kind of in any space, but rather allocating our dollars in a more effective way towards the threats and challenges we are facing, while making really far-reaching and significant investments here at home in American competitiveness and American long-term national strength.
So Jake, let me broaden that into another question that I wanted to ask you, which is how optimistic you really are that the next president, assuming it's not Trump, will be able to undo all of this damage that we've been referring to in this call. You know, the country is in an odd position right now. On the one hand, as we've been saying, US power, prestige, soft power, reputation are at a rock bottom. On the other hand, in hard power terms, the US remains by far the most powerful country in the world, and especially in national security terms. I fear that given the worldwide economic devastation, the threat of further waves of infection, the decline in democratic governance, the virtual collapse of entire regions like the Levant or of the Middle East, and the absence of competent leadership in all but a small minority of countries, I fear that this all means we're in for a very dark decade ahead. Now, clearly, Vice President Biden's initial sales pitch, which was competent management, is no longer going to cut it. What do you think his top national security priorities will have to be when he takes office? And how do you rate his chances in changing the broader narrative?
You know, I actually think mindset really matters. You can't just will things into existence that don't exist. But America having confidence in itself and projecting that confidence globally is enormously important in its own right, beyond the particular strategies that we choose to pursue. It is easy to do a tally of the challenges and problems we face, both here at home and around the world. But I think one thing about Vice President Biden is that he believes passionately that it is never a good bet to bet against the United States, and that our strengths dramatically outweigh our weaknesses, and that the best of what we can bring to bear can overcome the worst of what we face. And so I think projecting that confidence to the American people and to the world will create a circumstance in which allies and partners want to work with us, in which we get forward momentum around meaningful reforms in the international order, from climate to, yes, reforming the WHO, to updating the international economic and technology rules of the road. And frankly, I actually think coming out of a crisis like this, that opportunity is not diminished, it is enhanced, as long as there's propulsion, as long as there is a sense that, yes, we should not hold back in trying for an ambitious and effective set of strategies right out of the gate. And so you ask, what are the priorities? Some of them do involve just reversing steps the Trump administration has taken with respect to the Paris Climate Agreement, with respect to nuclear diplomacy with Iran, with respect to reinvigorating our alliances and our democratic partnerships, with respect to reasserting American leadership in international institutions. Those are fairly straightforward steps. But then beyond that, I think the vice president's view is there is a set of enormous challenges that no one country can deal with on their own, that require collective action, and that the United States should be driving that action, and not China and not anybody else. And so putting the United States back in a position of leading, mobilizing, and catalyzing cooperation around the big challenges that we all collectively face, I think will be a critical part of the vice president's agenda. And as part of that, a real focus on, to the point Kori was making earlier in the Zoom, fellow democracies, and how we rally and reinforce fellow democracies towards a shared vision of the world. You know, a lot of people who know me know I can be quite pessimistic about lots of things, but when it comes actually to America's moment right now, I'm weirdly and maybe counterintuitively quite an optimist. And I believe that we can and we will come back if we put our minds to it.
Well, Kori, I want to flip this to you now, because I know you tend to be an optimist, especially when it comes to the United States chances. And I should confess that I have been as well. I mean, I'm an immigrant who chose to vote with his feet by coming to live in this country because I believe in it. and its potential so much. That said, I'm extremely worried. And I'll tell you all in a second, but let me first read Sheldon Campbell's question. He's at the Yale School of Medicine, and he asks simply, how reversible is the damage to American institutions and relationships that have occurred in recent years? And what should be the highest priority for repairing things? And as you answer and tell us, Kori, whether you're still an optimist, I'd like you to address the two things that worry me the most, which is that the one thing, which is that our system has become so fundamentally broken in so many ways. If you look at just the impact that gerrymandering in Congress and the Citizens United decision have had, both of which have baked polarization into our system and will be extremely hard to overturn. How, with a system like this, can anybody turn things around?
So yes, I am still an optimist. You're right that increasing polarization is in part the result of things like gerrymandering, but you already see the reaction to it, right? Ranked choice voting making progress in several states. My native state of California creating a nonpartisan commission to align congressional districts. There are solutions to these problems, and the United States is actually really good on a 10-year time frame of creating institutional fixes to the institutional problems we create. So I actually think there's no reason to believe that a political system tied so tightly to the beliefs and priorities of its voters is incapable of solving its problems. The second thing is I'm about 2/3 convinced that the Trump administration may actually prove to be good for democracy in America, because all of us are having to confront full on what it looks like when we don't vote, when we don't encourage civil society to be a counterweight, when we allow Congress not to exercise its constitutional prerogatives of balancing executive power. And what I believe I have seen over the course of about the last 3 years, when the travel ban went into effect, lawyers all over America were offering their services pro bono, that you see prominent immigrants making the case that this kind of racist and sectarian exclusion is bad for the country. I think you see huge numbers of people turning out to vote in the 2018 midterm election and in special elections that have come since. So I think you do see a resurgence of vibrancy and individual responsibility for political outcomes in our country that's really fundamentally healthy in the medium term. And the last thing I would say is that I do actually think the odds are better than even that despite the catastrophic policy choices the American government has made over the course of the last several years, and in particular in the pandemic, we shouldn't underestimate the systemic sources of American dominance of the international order, the independence of the Federal Reserve, and the fact that they have moved in the last 6 months to become central banker to the entire world, something they were not doing before. The fact that, as Jake had pointed out, that Congress moved fast to be able to pump $4 trillion of stimulus into the system, something that John Maynard Keynes' eyes would have popped out at, and that interest rates remained at zero despite that. So the resilience and the built-in structural advantages that the United States have, we're slow to mobilize, we're disputatious, we make a lot of bad choices, but the dynamism of a society structured the way that ours is with very limited federal power and the strength of civil society and the experimentation that federalism brings us, and the vitality that immigration that you yourself represent, Jonathan. We've solved a lot of problems that countries like China haven't yet even begun to address, and will have very great degree of difficulty in coming to the kinds of solutions that propel their vitality in the way that Jake described about the momentum and dynamism of American society.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, as my Polish grandmother used to say. Jillian Burns, who's at George Washington University, asks what I think is a really important question, which is that in this current situation with the American public so focused on the domestic impact of the pandemic and the issues raised by the demonstrations, how can we possibly get voters to even think about foreign policy concerns when November rolls around? And this is always an issue in American elections, of course, where American voters have thoughts about foreign policy, they just tend not to vote on them. Jake, I imagine you're somewhat preoccupied with this right now, so you want to answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think one question is, to what extent should we be telling people, you got to focus on this right now, as opposed to focusing on things much closer to home? And frankly, in the current circumstance, when you've got 40 million unemployment claims, and real questions about just the very character of America, racial equity and systemic structural racism, protests on the streets, and you've got a continuing pandemic that the president wants to wish away, but is still taking 1,000 American lives every single day. I actually do think it's a little unfair to say, hey, people, please be thinking about the Belt Road Initiative, or about what's happening with respect to the emerging debt crisis and so forth. So in a way, I would divide between wanting people focused on quote unquote foreign policy issues and wanting people focused on the extent to which our fortunes are tied to the fortunes of people elsewhere. And I think at that more fundamental level, there is a case we should be advancing aggressively, particularly when it comes to COVID-19, because the only way we are ultimately going to solve this problem is by working together globally on a solution, a vaccine, and by trying to reduce the spread of this pandemic elsewhere so that it doesn't come back here with even greater force in a second wave or a third wave down the road. I think those are things that the American people very naturally, instinctively, not only understand, but embrace, have a practical view about, and would be prepared to support the deployment of resources in service of. So for me, I think the right way to think about this is not to try to lift up particular foreign policy issues, but rather to lift up an attitude that says, let's have leadership that recognizes that if your neighbor's house is on fire, you better grab a bucket, and that recognizes that how things play out in a city very few Americans had ever heard of, Wuhan, can end up having massive impacts in the United States. And there, I think there's a genuine opportunity over the course of the next 5 months, not so much to educate in some, patronizing way, but rather to inspire people to say, yeah, let's all collectively think about the ways in which we are connected and what we can do about it as Americans to play a greater role in making that interdependence work for us as opposed to against us.
So we're almost out of time, I should say, but we have so many questions coming in. I want to squeeze in a few more before we end. Jake Goodman, a Foreign Service officer at the State Department, asks, what would be the single change you would make to the national security bureaucracy, to its actual structure and processes rather than a specific policy prescription, that would best capture the broader and more accurate idea of national security that the pandemic has pushed us towards? Kori, I see you smiling. Why don't you field that?
I was tempted to put my hand up and say, pick me, pick me, pick me. The single most important change that I think we could make to the national security bureaucracy would be to treat the professional development and professionalism of America's foreign service officers as seriously as we take the professional development and professionalism of American military officers. We do not invest in ensuring that our trade negotiators, that our people who have consular responsibilities, that all of the breadth. America's diplomats are our first line of defense in the world, and we actually ought to treat them that way. We ought to make sure that the senior management of the Department of State focuses, that you have the equivalent of the Deputy Secretary of Defense, somebody who spends all of their time thinking about how do we bring the right people into the organization? How do we incentivize and structure it for their continued professional excellence? Because that's the shortcoming, that we don't take the professionalism of our non-military governmental experts as seriously as we do our military. And that has led to a militarization of American foreign policy in a way that's not good for us and is easily remediable.
Jake, Kathleen Tezantes, and forgive me, Kathleen, if I mispronounce your last name, who's from Long Island and now studying for a Master's of International Affairs at the University of Albany, asks, what do you think about the announcement that the United States will designate Antifa as a terrorist organization? Do you think it's legitimate or just an attempt to allow military and police force to be brought against the Black population and radical far left activists?
Well, first of all, the United States has the capacity to designate foreign organizations as terrorist organizations, not domestic organizations. So we can start with the fact that this is not a kind of credible announcement that was made. It was a purely political announcement. Secondly, I'm not a deep expert on Antifa, such as it is, but from what I do know, I think Antifa is probably better described as a loose collection of people on the internet who share tactics and tools, and people individually identify as part of this loose network, not so much an organization with a structure and leadership and funding and so forth. So, and then third, I think Antifa has become an excuse by the president and people around him who want to devalue and discredit these protests and the righteous anger and frustration of people out on the street. That all being said, of course, I would absolutely declaim violence and looting and burning and all of those things. But if you actually look at how that's played out, there are a variety of different causes for that, different in different cities. And the notion that there's some big boogeyman out there just called Antifa that's driving all of it, I think is too easy a crutch, and that a credible effort to respond both to the legitimate demands for justice from the protesters and the violence requires thinking that goes way beyond this cartoonish effort to kind of say, oh, it's all Antifa. Which I think has just become a political device and not something that is ultimately going to help bring progress in the US.
So this has to be our last question, unfortunately. So I'll pose it to both of you and welcome you to add any closing comments to your answers. Wayne Koo, who's from Singapore, but at the University of London, asks, with the current quagmire on civil issues and with the economy slowing down, added to the growing issue of income inequality in the United States, the indebtedness of the US government, et cetera, how will economics affect the foreign policy discussions in the campaign and in the White House, assuming there's another administration going forward? The simple way to put this is we are facing an economic crisis that is almost unprecedented, along with all of our other crises. What does that mean for US foreign policy and national security? Jake, you were just speaking, so let's continue with you and then we'll go to Kori.
Yeah, I'll just say two very brief things, recognizing the time. The first is I do think that there will be a genuine discussion about reshoring certain critical national security supply chains so that the US has supply chain resilience with respect to things like medical equipment and supplies. But I think that there will be a broader aperture on that. And that will sit at the intersection of economics and national security. That's one. And then I think the second important piece of this is that while the US has to tend to job creation, job growth, fair and equitable recovery in the United States, the fact is we may be facing a variety of different cascading economic and financial crises across the emerging economies of the world, and that will have a drag on the overall growth prospects here too. And so to Kori's point about the Fed playing a critical role, not just in the United States, but more broadly, I think discussions around a coordinated global economic response to this continuing well beyond just this emergency immediate period will be very important. And that will feature in the course of the campaign debate over the next few months as well. Thanks,
Jake. Kori.
So I'm sorry, Jonathan, that you didn't achieve your objective of driving Jake and me into a disagreement, because I endorse everything you just said. My sense is that one of the consequences of the pandemic will be to cause a reconsideration in the United States about a lot of elements that have made us different from other free societies. And most importantly, the stinginess of the social welfare net in the United States. I mean, as a conservative, it seems to me crazy that we allow employers to be the source of people's health care. That individual portable healthcare that doesn't rely on employment seems to me to be one thing that is going to be huge coming out of this, and that the Democrats were way ahead of me and my fellow Republicans on figuring out. So how do we strengthen the ability of Americans to be resilient in the face of an economic crisis? I think is one more thing that's going to actually strengthen the United States rather than weaken it coming out of the pandemic. And I think we're going to see a lot of experimentation in the states about different ways to address this problem. And that will be a reminder to us all about the dynamism of the American economy. Because one more lesson I think you can take from the financial crisis of 2008 is that the United States was the cause of that crisis, but we were also one of the economies quickest to recover. And that's the part of how the United States has a wider margin for error than other countries do. And so I think we're going to experiment, and it's going to be difficult, but also we are likely to come out of this quite strong, because we're going to be forced to solve some long-standing problems.
So at this point in the conversations, every week, I always say that I'm sorry that that's all the time that we have for today, but I really, really mean it in this case. It's been such an extraordinary conversation. I could easily spend another hour listening to Jake talk about the campaign and Biden's plans come January, and an hour listening to Kori talk about how you can still call yourself a conservative when you support government-sponsored healthcare for the entire American public, and what it means to be a conservative in Trump's America today. But we don't have time for any of that. So let me just say in conclusion that a recording of this webinar will be available shortly at foreignpolicy.com/live. Before we go, I also encourage everyone to check out our new power map called Data Governance. It's the most comprehensive assessment of data and privacy laws anyone has published to date, and it's only available to FP Insider subscribers. You can learn more at foreignpolicy.com/FP Insider. Don't forget to visit our website, foreignpolicy.com, for all the latest coverage on everything important happening in the United States and around the world. Let me just thank Kori Schake and Jake Sullivan one more time for lending us their brilliance. And thanks so much to all of you who have joined us. Please stay safe, Be well, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.